Hello, everybody, and welcome to our Marketplace webinar series. Today, we have the opportunity to hear about Windward's unique solution that supports financial institutions in regulatory compliance and promotes efficiency in trade finance activity. The integration between SureComp and Windward allows banks to automate the manual processing of regulatory compliance in trade finance and brings an innovative approach with AI analysis to detect suspicious activity and behavior of vessels. With the technology of SureComp's, customers can comply with the regulatory demands, increase trade finance department efficiency, and decrease the involved risk of processing trade finance transactions. I have the pleasure today to host Omer Elat. Omer is Windward's commercial director with a key focus on financial trade. Omer has extensive experience in global maritime and intelligence sector and a deep understanding of the banking and finance industry. Before we start, let's explain what regulation technology, which is also called RegTech, is and how banks do that today. Omer, what can you tell us about RegTech and where banks face it today?
Thanks, Asaf. Hi, everyone. Just as a quick recap, perhaps to give some context on where Windward is operating in the space of RegTech. But in general, I guess RegTech means the management of any regulatory process that helps the bank or any financial institution actually to comply with the different standards in each jurisdiction, but also with global standards. So it really consists with the management of regulatory monitoring, reporting, anything related to case management and actually providing the tools to close each case, be it via immediate clearance or additional processes that are related in more complicated events. So I guess within RegTech, if I can refer a bit to where Windward is operating in the space, Windward is sort of a strange bird in this area because the company exists for the past 10 years. And while we are, I would say, new 2 or 3 years in this space, we're very much operative in the federal market and working with the intelligence community in many leading organizations across the world. So basically, our technology, the Maritime Intelligence Platform, was built on the basis of this experience, where now we've kind of taken that platform and adjusting it to help other organizations within the private sectors and specifically financial institutions to meet regulatory requirements. So in that RegTech space, there's what we found is that there are a lot of applications related to trade finance and that consists with maritime and the trade space, where we can kind of look at RegTech and any gap that technology can solve, and this is what we're focused on in the context of regulation technology.
Interesting. Just to whom of you that just joined us, Omer here is from a Windward company that specializes in monitoring vessels' behavior and indicating insights about them. And Omer is the commercial director at Windward. So after explaining what RegTech is, maybe you can tell us, basically, I'm aware that 2021 brings several changes in regulatory requirements for financial institutions. So in terms of sanctions, which current regulatory and technological challenges banks face while processing transactions in trade finance, of course?
Yeah, so maybe it would be a good thing to provide sort of an overview on different regulatory trends that took place in the past few months across 2020, but also kicking off 21 with a bang on this side. So first of all, we've had the change of administration in the US, which will immediately define sort of a transition mode right now between different policies. Different policies mean basically different sanctions regimes. So we could expect different or changes to existing programs, whereas the US administration would perhaps try to pursue a more diplomatic way and to work with its partners around things like Iran or North Korea and so on. But I think apart from that, what we've seen across 2020 were a few financial guidelines or financial advisories issued by the US, then later by the UK regulatory regime. So really focusing on the different risks that are associated with maritime trade. So there was one financial advisory issued in 2020, in May 2020, which kind of coined what OFAC, the Office of Foreign Asset Control, is calling as deceptive shipping practices. These are specific activities that are being conducted by different networks of bad actors. And then they're kind of sort of utilizing maritime trade in order to facilitate money laundering and sometimes also sanction evasion. So we can kind of see that there was a focus on maritime in the context of sanctions. And if we kind of take this and try to understand, okay, what does it mean for financial institutions in terms of technological challenges? I think that's an interesting point to discuss. Obviously, there is more to it. For instance, just to give some background, we've seen new sanctions around Nord Stream 2. It's a pipeline project in the North Sea, whereas different entities are made aware by the US administration that working on this project might get them involved in sanctions. So I think sanctions are also going from the country level into the individual and corporate entity level. Again, referring to the challenge, the technological challenge that financial institutions are facing right now is really how do you map, how do you scope out the networks of entities that you don't want to be doing business with? So this is one technological challenge. I think this entire landscape is pretty much dynamic. So from one hand, you would have policy changes that technology should help you kind of adapt to it. And you could almost consider by definition that there is going to be a change within different policies. So any vendor that you work with, any basically technology that you integrate should be flexible enough to adapt to a new situation. And again, networks of bad actors are always kind of, so it seems that they're kind of ahead of the curve in terms of finding new ways, getting creative into, facilitating their own operations into the global financial system. So the idea is, how do you actually utilize technology in order to keep ahead of the game in terms of new typologies, different policies, and how do you actually take all of this and adapt it to your own dynamic risk appetite, which is obviously based on your business profile.
Well, it sounds like banks have a task that wouldn't be that easy, especially with all the regulatory changes and what OFAC and other agencies are requesting and all the trend in that aspect. And clearly, according to what you say, banks need to use technology to overcome or to solve part of the challenges they face. But if I am a bank operating in the international trade space, how should I approach this task or these challenges?
Yeah, so I guess the first question I would ask myself, and this is what I'm trying kind of to work with my clients, trying to guide them through, is really trying to understand, okay, what is my exposure to maritime risk in the context of sanctions, or if it's in the context of other areas. And I would advise to do the same for any type of client who's looking, okay, is this gap something that my organization needs to meet? And I would expect, as a client, I would expect my vendor to come and guide me towards understanding what's my maritime, what's my exposure to maritime risk across different lines of businesses, but obviously focusing on trade finance. So I would assume that there is a system in place to facilitate trade transactions, be it with documented trade or open accounts. And then the question would be really, what is the awareness of these type of, I would say, red flags that were coined by the different regulators? What is there an appetite to kind of meet these requirements? Then great, let's now kind of check what is the exposure within the organization. One of the things that we're doing with our clients is kind of sort of a test that would allow to map using our data, for instance, that would allow to map what's the type of hit within different areas, sort of like a bone mapping sort of a process where you can really inject a list of entities and you could say, okay, if I'm looking for a perspective of this vendor, what's the hit rate? Where am I exposed? Is this something that I'm familiar with, or is this completely new? And then you could kind of start to scope out which departments you would like to look into. Is it like a specific trend? And some of the times I would say it should be aligned with the own risk matrix that the organization already had in place. I mean, obviously, if you're signing off clients in the Gulf countries, so you might be want to look at, for instance, Iran sanctions programs to make sure that these entities are not associated with any designated entity. So it really varies with the different business portfolio that you have, and that's kind of the first thing that I would consider looking at. And second thing, I would say, can these gaps, can they be automated using technology? Do I want to address them? Do I want to address them do I want to outsource them? Do I want to apply different procedures? And I'm happy to kind of carry the burden because I already have the capacity to carry out different investigations. I could say that the majority of feedback that I get here is leans towards the full automation, specifically when speaking with front offices and middle offices. The idea is to automate as much as possible, whereas any hit for a potential gap or anomaly will be screened by other departments. So then it brings me to another challenge. How do you plan to deal with these kind of escalations, right? Because the flow is not, you could utilize technology and AI in order to impact and collapse the hit rate and the rate of false positives, but there needs to be a human in the loop in order to clear out those events.
I didn't say, but if anyone has any question, feel free to use the Q&A panel to ask any questions. Omer, so it seems like we are using here in AI, artificial intelligence, or big data in order to use or leverage all this technology. And as we learned also in previous webinars we held here, leveraging big data and AI can be very beneficial to predict risks and automate manual work, as you just mentioned and explained. What are the main benefits of using the AI system on these challenges specifically compared on using traditional data providers?
Yeah, so it's a great question, but just if to frame it a bit, if looking again at the system where you have trade finance controls in place and where you do most of your screenings for the counterparties and you're looking for that maritime piece, I guess AI here is not, it would be the means to an end, right? So AI should be leveraged to do the heavy lifting in the backend at your vendor's cloud to analyze all of the data which is related to maritime trade, from AIS to ownership and registry, to different cargo data, meaning bill of ladings and so on. So any type of input that could be dealt in the background in order to provide what is called sort of an immediate clearance recommendation, right? So on one level where you have the first initial screening, the difference with using AI would be to get the immediate clearance, whereas if you're using traditional rule-based algorithms, you might actually need to do the heavy lifting and the manual analysis in order to get into that clearance recommendation from the get-go. So this is in one level. And then again, on the level for investigations, I would say AI should really be the differentiator between on how much time you spend on each case. So clearance in simple cases should bring, using AI should bring the time on each case to immediate, up to 10 minutes. And in complicated cases, it would be up to 2 or 3, 4 hours. Whereas what we've seen with working with our clients and their existing vendors, these cases might get so complicated that you would need a day or two just in order to close them. And whereas you would have to spend, in average, 2 hours on each simple case. So imagine the type of hits that you would have from the get-go if you're injecting a type of data set. And then also there is the level of screening this data set if anything pops up. I think it's important to maybe add another perspective to it, because what we spoke about so far is sort of the intuitive, whereas you, as part of your workflow, be it document a trade, you are screening different counterparts and you're like trying to check whether there is maritime risk on your existing portfolio. There is another aspect to it, which I think covers additional players in the market, those that are involved also in open accounts, where there the network would be perhaps even larger or wider, because there are, I would say, about 70,000 legal entities that are operative in the trade space. But when you enlarge that into actually any account holder or entity that transacts with the SWIFT system, the number of entities that are involved is potentially bigger, and hence the exposure might be bigger.
Seems a bit risky to do that without technology. Yeah. We have a question from the audience, and Edward asks, basically that, or says that AI doesn't worth much without having the training or without having the data that it's being processing and then predict. So maybe you can give a glimpse about Windward's data and what you process, where it comes from.
Yeah, it's a great question. I'd be happy to elaborate. So if we take a step back and come back to what Windward has in terms of technology, we have in the background what we call a maritime intelligence platform, where we fuse different sources, be it, as I mentioned, behavioral positional data coming from AIS, satellite and terrestrial, ownership and registry, which is based on different partnerships that we have in the market, and provides us the coverage for the different levels of ownership or the legal entities that are associated with each vessel. The reason that we kind of look at this component as critical, because also for our clients, financial institutions, the entity itself is the main, the legal entity itself is the main entity that they're looking at as part of their transactions. And then we go also to cover cargo. So in areas of wet commodities, it would be using partnerships with different market vendors. And we're also looking at container data. So this is in terms of data pipeline and what is getting into that pipeline in the get-go. There are additional use cases which are more ad hoc, but basically our mantra is additional layers, additional insights. So when we take all of these sources and we kind of create a unified form for each vessel in the world and each legal entity that is related to them, we now start to apply AI from analyzing the vessel's behaviors. So for instance, if you look at an activity like ship-to-ship, or a ship-to-ship operation where two vessels actually transact with each other, there's no way to apply that using a rule-based algorithm. So this is kind of one of the first models that we've started to apply AI with. And what we did is we actually tagged thousands of cases using our maritime domain experts in order to identify, those cases where we say, okay, there is a ship-to-ship operation there. And we kind of trained the model. So this is a supervised model, and we applied it on a global scale. Another, I think, example which sort of jumps towards the, how do you actually train our models to identify those vessels which we think are more, I would say, unusual, So we take cases of known vessels which got designated in the past, and we analyze their behaviors. And we say, okay, this vessel before it got designated, it just had a dark activity, a ship-to-ship here, and it changed its identity for a few times just before doing that. So we kind of map those profiles, and we apply our models to identify all of the vessels from the global fleet that actually meet the criteria for these vessels.
Thank you, Omer. I believe you answered pretty clearly on the question. Going back, we have today in the market tens of different solutions, and everybody says it has the best one. How can banks make sure they are implementing the right one, the right solution, and what a bank should consider when picking a technology to solve the challenges that you just mentioned when we were discussing through this session?
Yeah, so really it depends on what is the type of operation that you're looking to have. I mean, is it for instance a build or buy? Are you looking to build your own capacity for maritime screening, and you simply want to integrate specific inputs? So the context of each vendor should be put in the specific problem that is trying to solve. But if you're looking for sort of a one-stop shop for maritime, I would say, I would look at the type of analysis that's being conducted on the data. Things like recall and accuracy should be really important. Let me give just one example. When we screen the global fleet on each given day, we would have sometimes more than 100,000 events of AIS transmission gaps at each day from the global merchant fleet. And when we kind of now start to analyze them to understand, okay, which activity is actually unusual, we can narrow it down to just a few thousand events each day. And when we then apply it to the context of sanctions risk or compliance risk, you can get it into less than 100 for each day on the entire global fleet. So really the type of analysis that's being done on the background is important for you to understand what is the scope of false positive that you're looking to meet, how does RICO look like, and it should be, again, adjusted to your own risk appetite. Because if you don't want to miss anything, then RICO is a king. But if you're favoring efficiency and you're kind of sailing closer to the wind, this is the type of flexibility that I would recommend having. I would definitely try to understand if AI solves a specific problem there, and if so, is it really the problem that you're looking to solve? And coming back to what we've mentioned in the beginning, I think accepting the fact that the regulatory landscape is dynamic is key, and it's important to make sure that your vendors also understand that, because you don't want to onboard a technology which would be out of date just in a few months, simply because different regulatory regimes have changed, or bad actors just changed their network and they're now transacting in, or they're now conducting ship-to-ship operations offshore Singapore instead of offshore Iran.
Thanks, Omer. I think it's a very valuable insight to have. Going to our last questions, what would you say can be a trigger to initiate an implementation project of such technology and acquire advanced capabilities to comply with the mentioned regulation? Because basically, the managers don't really know when they have to use that. And we see the trend of the regulation, how it changes, but when they should do that and for how long they should consider to see that, what we can see about the ROI or the value of such technology. So,
yeah, so I will touch on ROI in just a second. The reason that I'm smiling was ROI in compliance is a little bit tricky, but I'll try to give our perspective on that. But I think a triggering event might be the understanding that there is a gap this understanding should come from your advisory teams, trade finance advisory, financial crime, different sanctions teams that are actually saying it could come from a bottom up to senior leadership saying there are specific gaps that we keep on identifying on a constant basis, and we think that we need to reconsider them. Some others might be the different trends in the market, and I think, you know, seeing the ACAMS paper from just a few months ago about the adoption of different maritime or technologies to enhance maritime due diligence is I think, a key document which should provide additional guidance. And I think the complexity of trade and the challenge of identifying trade-based money laundering is also an important component from maritime sanctions, and I think these are all intertwined. So I guess the teams that are busy or in charge identifying these gaps should provide that solid indication. Again, this should be considered and cross-referenced with each financial institution's business portfolio to really understand, is this something that they need to meet? Regarding ROI, I would say, I think maybe if I could share my screen and just give you a bit of a taste. Let's see.
While you're sharing your screen, we have a quick question, which I think you won't be able to answer that. They ask if you can share the name of the clients of Windward in Asia Pacific. Feel free not, if it's confidential, of course.
So I'd be happy to share that on a different type of forum based on our agreements with our clients. But definitely there are clients that we value and they appear on our news and PRs. So I could definitely mention some of them, and we're working with them, so it's fully aware on our website and content. If coming back for a second to the question on ROI, I think again, in the context of maritime, so when we look at the global fleet, the global merchant fleet, what you see here is actually a breakdown of the risk out of all vessels that we at least screen for compliance, different type of risk indicators. And you can see the majority of the fleet is being cleared, I would say. But what hides here, and that's a note to our product team in that case, is that the amount of false positives, the amount of vessels which are screened and cleared automatically is about 12%. So if we're looking at ROI, and if we're looking at the global fleet, the same exposure or the same proportion should be applied on each specific business portfolio. So if a bank is transacting with in the maritime space, he should expect a 12% of false positives if he's screening with traditional technologies, I would say. And that is only because maritime is complicated, and you just simply can't make any assumption, direct assumption related for risk management when looking at AIS just that directly. So I guess this is kind of the breakdown, and I just picked one or two vessels here to perhaps relate to the flow that would happen as part of you know, how to utilize this data. So let's say your API would call for a specific IMO or name. The idea is to, again, do the heavy lifting in the background and to cover the organization for the different deceptive shipping practices which were highlighted or flagged, and whatever other information that is included is simply not relevant, because the idea is to bring maritime risk into corporate world and not to make you as an operator in the trade space to develop a maritime capacity in order to carry on your business.
Thank you, Omer. If you mind just to stop sharing the screen. Our time is up, unfortunately, though we could speak for much more time. I see we have another questions. They speak about the connectivity with banks platforms. Would it be via API? So this is a yes/no question.
Yeah, so I guess the short answer is yes, but definitely it really depends on what is the specific application. So the more complicated answer is that it needs a little bit more details.
Okay, so I hope our audience learned a few things through this webinar. Thank you, Omer, it was a pleasure to host you here with us today. For those of you that want to hear more and ask more questions, just fill the survey at the end of this session. We will be glad to get back to you. Thank you all for joining us. See you on our next session in May. Thank you, Omer.
Thank you, Asaf. Bye-bye.